we're going to introduce our panel tonight. And it's a real privilege first to welcome Graham Tomlin. Graham is the director of the Centre for Cultural Witness. He's also the editor-in-chief of the website Seen and Unseen. He is the former Bishop of Kensington, and he is the founder and the president and the chair of St. Mellitus College.
Yeah, and he is going to be joined and in conversation with Esau McCaulley, who is an author, contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, the Jonathan Blanchard Associate Professor of New Testament and Public Theology at Wheaton College, which is the longest title I've ever had to read out. He's been named as one of the most influential faith leaders in America right now, and his latest book, which is on sale again, How Far to the Promised Land, was in Amazon's top 5 nonfiction for 2023. So if you could please join me in welcoming our contributors for this evening.
Good. It's always nice when the microphones are turned on.
Yes, I don't know who told you I was named the most influential. I never saw that, but thank you.
Yeah, no, we read it.
I think you just added that to my CV, but I'm going to keep it now. It's been said that someone said that about me. I guess it's now true.
No, we definitely found that on a website somewhere. So you are, whether you know it or not, you are one of the most influential. Esau, it's great to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. And can I extend my welcome to all of you? It's great to see many of you here, many friends, and people if this is your first time in St. Mellitus, a big welcome to you as well. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you find it as interesting as I think I'm going to as well. So I've been spending some time reading your book, How Far to the Promised Land. In fact, I have a queue in my family who've been trying to sort of wrest it off me for the last few days. And I've been saying, no, I got to read it. So
you could have just bought them another copy, but that's fine.
I could have done.
I don't know what they played the bishops here in England.
Yeah. They don't pay us much these days. And we're pretty mean in our family. So we'll share it around. But Esau, it's really good to have you with us. And you're flying out tomorrow. You've been in England for the last 6 months, is that right?
Yes, I've been on sabbatical at Oxford, at Yarnton, and with Wycliffe Hall. And so I've been here for the last 5 months. And so it's been great. I've fallen in love with London, a little bit of football, a little bit of West End plays, and all the other good stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I was hearing you become a bit of a football fan. I mean, you are a footballer in the kind of a strange American way
sense,
that you think.
I can't kick anything.
Exactly, yeah. I always thought that's a weird thing that Americans call it football, but you never actually kick your foot to the ball.
You want to litigate that right now? We can.
Yeah, exactly. But you got to know a little bit of English football?
Yes, we got to go and see Tottenham play a couple of times, and my son fell in love with the Hotspurs, and so wow.
There you go.
Yeah, I realized that they're pretty intense about that here too.
Yeah, they are.
One guy stopped and was going to give me a ride because I had my jersey on earlier. He said, "I want to give us a ride to a Tottenham supporter." Another guy went past me, so it really depends on what you
exactly.
get.
Play your cards right. Yep. And you've been in the UK for 6 months, and you've spent some time here in the past. You were at St Andrews. I mean, just to start out, I'd love to get your reflections on what are the differences? What are the things you notice here that's different from the US? We often say we're a kind of...
I spent 3 years in St Andrews doing my PhD, and I spent the last 5 months here in Oxford. And that's here... I've been here long enough to probably have misguided opinions. So forgive me if an American can speak a little bit about the differences. One of the things I was noticing, and I kind of thought about it when I came in here. I came in and I was awed by this particular building. And I was looking at the altar, and Bishop Tomlin, who's been here forever, he's like, oh, whatever. And he kind of shows me, the basement. And I think, that was really what I've seen a lot about Christianity in Britain, is that you have this wonderful legacy of art and culture and people who've done great things for the faith, including people from the, what's his name? The abolitionist guy.
William Wilberforce.
Yes, and so you have this great legacy, but sometimes it feels like you don't believe in it.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's this sense in which there's so much potential here. I walk into some of the chapels in Oxford, and this is not to speak ill about any of the chaplains there, so I don't know them personally, but I was like, what would it be like if everybody here preached and lived as if they believed this stuff? Now, the problem in America is we think that we know it and we don't. Like, we're very confident, but we've gotten significant elements of the gospel wrong in its combination with power. And so I think in America, we're still trying to kind of enforce our view of God on an unwilling public. And the Brits have sometimes, you have such a fear the legacy of colonialization and all the things you've done wrong that you don't want to force anything on anybody. I remember, well, I won't tell too many stories of my time in the UK, but when I first got here, I was serving in a parish that will remain nameless all the way in Scotland, so you never find it. And it was for Easter, and they knew they were going to have a bunch of kids come for Easter because it was like one of the big services. And they said, we're going to have a program for the kids. And I said, oh, great. This is going to be the only time the kids are going to be here. Why don't we give them a gospel presentation? Say something about Jesus. Oh, no. We don't want to force it on them. I was like, it's Easter. This is literally what it's for. And they're like, we don't want you working with the kids. You're like way too American. And so that's what I feel, that sometimes that there's just a lack of, not about urgency, but just confidence that this stuff matters. And it actually is good news that can change lives. Yeah.
That's really good, and it's very good sometimes to have that sort of perspective from the outside that helps us to see things that we're a bit blind to. Esau, I'd love to ask you a little bit about, we'll come on a little bit later on to some of the questions you were raising about kind of American religion and politics and so on. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your story that's here in this book. You grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that place. What was great about it and what was really challenging about it growing up?
Well, I think the best way to kind of get your head around what I was attempting to do and how far to the promised land is there's a way of thinking about people who grow up in poverty and then who make it to success, what people consider success. Like the CV that you just heard. If the people want to hear, well, what was special about this person that got them there? So there's a tendency to push everyone into a hero's journey. But the problem is, I was actually around myself when I was a kid, and there were a bunch of people who were just as gifted and just as talented and who wanted it just as bad as I did, for whom life got in the way. And so what I wanted to be able to do was paint a picture of the entirety of my community and have people look around. Because when you see the entirety of that community, the good and the bad, it gets rid of that idea that if you just want it bad enough, you'll get it. And so what I wanted to do was tell complicated stories. And the other thing that is also true, especially in the Black South, is that sometimes the lives that we consider failures are as instructive as the lives that we can consider successful. I had a friend of mine who, and maybe, I don't know if this is a question you had later, but I'm going to jump on it now. I had a friend of mine, we grew up together, his mom and my mom, both single parents, both raised their kids to stay out of trouble. She spoiled him. His name was Jesse. She spoiled him, did everything she was supposed to. And we saw each other at like an arts festival about a month or two before we were getting ready to go to college. I was going to the University of the South, Swanee. He was going to Middle Tennessee State. It's about an hour away from where I was going to university. We said, hey, we should meet up with one another when we get to college. We'll be an hour away. I said, sure. And so I'm getting ready to go to college. The morning, I'm getting ready to get in the car. My car's packed up. And you have this, in America, this big thing where you pack your car up and you drive off to university. This amazing moment. And on the news, I see my friend's face. That's interesting. Like, what's happening? And he had been murdered. Someone had, he was saying goodbye to his girlfriend, just like everybody else does when they go to university. And someone had come up to him when they wanted his rims, these things on his car. And he didn't give it fast enough, and they shot him and killed him. But the only thing the news says is like young inner city youth murdered in drive-by. Well, which one of our stories reveals something about America? My story, because I made it to college, or his story, because he was killed? And both of those things happened in my neighborhood. And so when I went to college, I felt the responsibility not just to carry my story, but the stories of the people who didn't make it, so they can understand that all of these things are part of what makes America America. Because you might ask the question is, how did that particular neighborhood get dangerous? Maybe I'll tell you that. That neighborhood got dangerous because the generation before, after integration, all of the businesses left, and it's this thing called white flight. So then the economic infrastructure of the community dropped, crime rose, violence increased. And so what happened to my friend was, yes, the decision made by two youths on a random Friday night, but it stretches back to the civil rights movement, integration, gentrification, and the complicated nature of race in America. I wish I could tell you more. Sorry, I'm going to tell you one more, and then I'll let you ask another question. Because you all should understand what's happening in the country. So then the economic ladder drops in my neighborhood. Property value decreases. Then, since this book was written, they then come and they buy up that neighborhood because it's cheap, because my town is now growing. And now the white community is coming back. And the place around the corner where that kid was murdered is now a park where there are no black people. And that's the economic history of that place. So for me to simply say, I worked hard and I studied and I said my prayers, and that's why I made it, it's just an inaccurate depiction of what it's like to grow up in those types of communities. And I felt like I wanted to tell the story that made people see it and feel it. And so you had to meet my neighborhood.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me reading it, was that it wasn't actually a story about you. It was a story about you, but it was a story about your family, your neighborhood, and the complexities of the neighborhood in which you grew up, and some of the kind of wider economic, social influences upon that neighborhood that made it what it was. And I suppose one of the things that struck me about it, I mean, you had that phrase, this is a story not about me, but about us.
Yeah.
It was a kind of communal story.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there were one or two other of those people that were particularly influential upon you and the way you grew and developed.
Yes.
Who would be those people, and would you describe them for us?
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was introduce the world to people whose stories I couldn't forget. And if I couldn't forget them and they influenced how I lived my life before God, I felt like if you met them, you couldn't forget them either. One of the stories, one of the people who meant a lot to me was my aunt, whose cousin named Clarice. That's not her real name, but it's just been changed in the book. And she grew up as a 15-year-old, she was a 15-year-old kid, just like any other 15-year-old kid. She was older than me, and she was one of those cool teenagers who everyone kind of looked up to and wanted to be like. And she was 15. She met a boy like a lot of 15-year-old girls do. They had a relationship, and the next thing you know, she gets pregnant, and she has the child. Little did she know that 15-year-old boy that she met had AIDS. First boyfriend. And this was in the 80s, before we really understood what AIDS was and what it meant and what it looked like. And there was almost like COVID, but to the 10th power, if anybody was alive during that time. And I saw my family separate from her. And so there's this one story that I tell in the book, and I don't want to go too far into it, but the child that she has is sick. And she takes the child to the hospital. And because she had an outstanding bill for $52, I think it was $52, it was $26. It was less than $70 in the United States. They refused service. And so over the course of 5 to 7 hours, she continues to negotiate with them. But eventually they finally let the child into the hospital. But the child dies by the next day. And so what should have been the last hours of that child's life receiving medical care was actually spent in the emergency room waiting to be let in. And so for a long time, the hospital refuses any liability. And my cousin is 15 at the time. She takes the hospital to court, all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court, and overturns the law, leads to the overturning of the law that allows for hospitals to be sued in Alabama for refusing service. You can look her up. If you Google it, you can find the state versus so-and-so. And what was so moving to me about that is she's battling a deadly disease, but she still said within herself, I'm a person. And she fought to change the laws. She had an insurance policy. This may not translate to how you do things here in the UK. But the insurance policy said that you had to live a certain amount of time before the policy was vested. And after she passed away, my mom found her diary. And in the diary, she would write prayers to her T cells. And she would say to them, like the loaves and the fishes multiply, I need the T cells to fight the disease to multiply long enough for me to have the policy vested so that when she passed away, she would give that money to her children. And she did. She lived long enough for that policy to be vested. And that money does actually fund the lives of her children who go off to and do fine in the world. And so she dies in a hospital, things coming all out of her body. And somebody might say, well, this is just a young girl who caught AIDS as a teenager and then died. But she showed me something about courage and fidelity. And does the life that she lived and the disrespect she endured, does it also tell us something about America? One of my last meetings with her, and I think the way that I tell it has been influenced by me hanging around Anglicans for so long. But in the 80s, you just didn't know a lot about how AIDS was transmitted. You see, there was a real fear of sharing food with her. And she had come to stay with our family because she was down on her luck. She had a boyfriend who had been abusive, and so she came to our house, and she was beaten and bloody, and she would often just lay on the couch. But one particular day, she was feeling strong enough to sit up, and I'd come home from school, and I made myself some fries. Y'all call them chips. I made some chips and covered them in ketchup. And she came to me, and she said, Esau, can we share some food together? And I remember I was in middle school at the time being terrified because I said, if she bleeds into the fries, I don't know if I'm going to catch AIDS. But then I remember my grandfather used to preach about the blood of Jesus, how the blood of Jesus was so powerful. I said a prayer that the blood of Jesus would overcome the blood that was dripping from her mouth. And so we sat there and we dipped our hands together and we sat there and ate the fries while we watched television. And now I can't help but think about it as communion. Yeah. Like the sharing of this blood, well, I don't know if it was actually her blood, this food and this moment of taking and eating, there was a real sense of fellowship. And so she was someone who I loved and who I cared about dearly and who shaped my understanding of what the hospital system ought to do for people. And it taught me something about a life lived with dignity that people would otherwise ignore, but has its own glory in it. And so I didn't want to throw her life away and say that her life wasn't valuable, but my life was. So in the stories, in the book, I try to introduce people to characters like her.
Yeah, that is a very powerful story. And Esau, you recount one story in the book where you talk about how you went to a particular neighborhood one night. I think it was to meet a girlfriend, and you were confronted by a group of pretty hostile young men.
Yeah.
And they kind of asked you the question, who are you? And you gave an answer, which was quite a significant one for you. I'd love you to tell that story and why that was such an important moment for you.
And maybe this is why I think that the church is so important for me. It's because I remember when I was a kid, I would come to church on Sunday, and I had a clear idea. I'm from the Baptist tradition, so you got to understand it. We preached in the Baptist church, in the Black Baptist church. We don't mess around.
Yeah, we don't preach in the Anglican church.
So we preach. I'm not saying that y'all, I'm an Anglican, I'm with you now. I'm just telling you how we used to do it.
I was a Baptist.
There we go. You know what I'm talking about.
Baptist too.
And so I would come to church and I would if he preaches well enough to convince me not to sin, I'm going to be a Christian that week. If not, I'm in the streets, right? And so my faith is a week to week kind of piety. And for a long time, I didn't really know how Christian I was. Because that was how my faith was. It was 1 week I was, 1 week I wasn't. And I had met this girl back at the mall. Back in the day, I used to go to the mall, and I met her. And she said, this is before GPS. She would just tell you the address, and you just have to find your way there, just by scent and by hope. You just I think she's over here. And so I was driving through what we call the projects, which is the rough part of town. And there's no... Sorry, you all know this about America. There's no gun laws. Everybody's armed, okay? And so I'm in this part of America where I run into these guys and they ask me this question, where are you from? And in the South, there's different ways to ask that question. But when they said it there, they was asking, like, what neighborhood are you from? And the response I was supposed to give is, I'm from, J.L. Johnson High School, here, here, and here. And then they asked me, like, who are you? And I don't know why, because I seen one of them had a gun. And I don't know why that question, where are you from, followed by who are you, it almost, like, the way that I talk about it in the book is also true now, because I don't even know why I said it. I said I'm a Christian. And the moment I said it, I regretted it, because that sounds soft in that neighborhood, because I wanted to say I'm about that life, but I didn't. And so they laughed at me. They laughed at me, and they, like, walked away. And I realized when I saw them in this neighborhood, and it's just like, it's the bricks. I'm like, I'm about to get shot because this person is trying to defend a part of a community that neither of us want to be in. They were both trapped in this same game they've been playing over and over and over again, and all the paths that have led out of it has always ended up back in the same place. And it was in that moment where I said, who actually might be able to help us out? God. And it was one of those times where I discovered my faith when I was pressed. And I said this to my students. One of my problems, I'm a professor, I just want to talk about stuff. And I say to the students all the time, you don't know what you believe until you're pressed. Yeah. It's in that moment where the rubber meets the road, not just life or death, but you find out. And I found out that I was a Christian. And I was like, man, that messes up everything. But it was just true. It was in me. It was like all of those sermons and all of my grandmother's prayers and all of my mom's prayers bore fruit in that moment, and it might have saved my life.
And I guess going on from there, I mean, many black people in neighborhoods where you grew up left the church because it was implicit in slavery and it was tied up in sort of patterns of racism in America. Yeah. You didn't. And I guess my question is, why didn't you?
Yeah, I think that, one, I've been to a lot of places. I've been to Oxford, so I've been to St. Andrews. I'm here in London. And I've had a lot of intellectual challenges to my faith in adulthood. And I will say I've never been pressed more intellectually or emotionally than I was pressed in that neighborhood. Because the question wasn't just whether or not the gospel was true, it was whether or not it matters that it was true and how it might help us live better lives. And it is true that if you look at the history of the church, you see the church's complicity in slavery. And after slavery, Jim Crow and segregation and opposition to the civil rights movement. But it is also true that my ancestors saw in that same book a God who liberates. And one of the interesting things that I do, and this is one of the things about being a theologian or historian, is you can actually read what black Christians were saying at these key points in American history. So if you look back to the Emancipation Proclamation, you see black Christians there, and they say very clearly, it wasn't Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves, it was God. And so as they were experiencing these things in the 1800s and then in the 1960s, they said that this was the movement of God that led to the civil rights movement. So the people who were alive at the time were saying, we have made this progress because of God. When we then get, 50 years down the road and we look back on it, we say where God was at. Well, the testimony of the people who lived it actually matters. And so the fact that one of the first things that my ancestors did after slavery was build black churches, to me, testified to the importance of the church. One of the things that people often talk about, and this is going to be in the next book that I'm going to write, but I'll give you a preview. Remind me in 5 years, this will be in there. People often talk about the church's confusion about slavery. You know who wasn't confused about slavery? Black people, black Christians. There's no black pro-slavery movement in the United States. We all read that Bible and said, this book seems to be a book that liberates. So there was almost a complete consensus in the black church as it relates to the liberative power of the gospel. It was the white Christians who were confused, right? And so for me to center the theological interpretations of my oppressors in deciding whether or not Christianity is true would be to concede the idea that they get to make that decision. And I used to say, like, white supremacy in America has taken a lot from black people. It shouldn't take Jesus from us too. And so I could not read this book and not discover a God who's a friend and not an enemy. So in other words, I just believe Frederick Douglass more than I believe George Washington.
Yeah. Thank you. And one of the other things that strikes me about your book when you write about it is there's a great deal of grace and forgiveness in the book.
Yeah.
That you write. You've told some of the stories already of people who you might look on from a distance and say, well, Leah, that's people you might look down on, but you somehow just display a great deal of graciousness and forgiveness, even towards the real villains of the story. And there are some villains in your story.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, how do you, when you've lived through in a neighborhood which has been the victim in many ways of kind of decisions that have been taken about it, which has made the upbringing for people like yourself and others around so difficult. How do you retain grace and forgiveness within that? How do you kind of stop becoming bitter? How do you stop becoming angry? Because again, that's part of the story as well. People becoming bitter because of those experiences.
The origin point of the book is that my father dies he was a truck driver, and he passes away in a single car accident in California, far from my family. And he had abandoned my family when I was younger. And my parents, my mom and the siblings asked me to do the eulogy. And anyone who's been a clergy person knows when you do the eulogy, especially someone who you didn't know, because I know my father very well because he had been out of my life, you sit down with their family. And as a clergy person, you have, I think, some real responsibilities. One is that you can't lie. But you also have to try to find out what God is up to in the life of that person. And you're trying to find something redemptive. And so I sat down with my family to learn about his story and learn about the things that happened to him. And what I saw was what was a simple understanding of him as a child was much more complex to understand the entire shape of his life. And so that attempt to find something redemptive in that preparing that eulogy helped me understand both sides of people's stories. One of the things that happens is that when you're a clergy person, you often meet people who are at the other end. So they've made their mistakes, and then they come to you. And you say, it doesn't matter what you've done in the past. God can forgive and you can make a fresh start. But oftentimes, you meet that person at the beginning of the fresh start. You don't know that the entire past in which they've harmed and wounded people. And so what I've learned is I could not preach grace to people who came to my church and then not show that grace to the people who are closest to me. And my father, who had abandoned us, was one of the people who was in need of that kind of gracious reflection. And so the attempt to make sense of his life in the context of the wider purposes of God helped me to try to look for those kind of redemptive elements in other people's life. And I think that one of the things that really divides American culture is that we tend to think one or two things are true. They were all determined by our circumstances, that the structures and pressures of society force us to do the bad things that we do. Or it's all a personal decision. We make bad decisions because we're broken. But what I actually saw in the life of my father and the life of the people in my neighborhood was a mix of those things, right? That in some sense, we all live in a broken world, and so you are responsible for the decisions that you make. But sometimes society greases the wheels to make it easier for you to make those kinds of decisions. And so what I tried to do was to tell stories that neither excused the wrongs that people did or pretended that there were no other outside forces driving them. And one of the other things that I think about is that sometimes we think that a successful Christian life is only one in which someone completes the process of transformation, even though that's not true for anyone. sometimes there's the beginning of a turn, and that's all that you see. But there's something beautiful in that beginning of the turn. And so I was trying to find ways to articulate those elements of like, here's where they were trying to pull themselves together, even if they didn't get there. And I think that for some of the people who we love the most, that's the most that we can hope for, that they are stretching out towards God, stumbling down the road, even if they don't get as far as we would like.
And I think it's one of the reasons why I'd urge you, if you can, to buy the book and read it, because it is a great lesson in grace and forgiveness and that reading of other people with eyes of compassion. And I think you do that so well in getting that balance right between, as you say, personal responsibility, and yet the context in which we're placed shapes and makes it easier or harder to make certain decisions.
I would make a lot more money if I said if it was either one or the other.
Exactly.
There's people who want it to be all structure and it's all personal responsibility, but like we are. Sorry, I'm going to be 30 seconds of Anglicanism. In baptism, right? When you're baptized, at least in the American liturgies, you announce three things: the world, the flesh, and the devil. What causes me to sin? My own desires that kind of take me away. The spiritual forces in society, or society's brokenness itself. And so to turn towards God is to turn away from those three things. And in any given moment, which one of these things is causing me to do the wrong that I do? Is it the world? Is it my own desire? Is it spiritual realities? And I think that trying to parse that out is impossible. So I think we should account for all of those in the human experience.
And just digging a little bit closer into, moving on a little bit from your book, How Far to the Promised Land, to your earlier book, Reading the Bible While Black, and which again is a fascinating kind of look at how black people read the Bible. Yeah. And I guess, again, many people would argue that the Bible is the problem behind slavery because it's justified that slavery. Yeah. Do they have a point?
No. Sorry. I mean that sounds dismissive. I think it is really important to realize what we have to do as it relates to the Bible. And what that means is when you have a variety of texts that are written across time in different cultures and contexts, in order to do this thing called theology, you have to do something called synthesis. You have to put text together in a way that makes some kind of theological account of God in the world. And you have to say something like, yes, we have these passages in Paul that says slaves submit to your masters. We also have something called the Exodus narrative where God liberates people. We also have something like the prophets where God speaks about the God of injustice. And what you have to do as a Christian theologian is to put all of these texts together and make an account of God and his purposes in the world. And I am convinced that if you do that process of theology, if you synthesize text and say, is the God who we encounter in this text fundamentally a God who wants to create a hierarchy of people rooted in race, with black people on the bottom and white people on the top? Or is this God who says that we're all essentially equal, created in the image of God, made for glory, but are hindered by sin? And because I see that God, and I see the Jesus who comes down and who identifies with the stepped-on peoples of the world, it is not a radical idea to say that the way that Christianity shapes the imagination of the believer ought to lead us towards liberation. And it is also the case that in every single culture in which the Bible has gone, the oppressed people in that culture have seen in that book a friend and not an enemy. I was speaking in actually Wycliffe a few days ago, and a guy from India who was a Dalit, he said to me, we read this book and we saw the image of God and we were lifted up. And I said, shockingly, the African Americans in the United States saw the same thing. And so the question is, does the consensus of black and brown people all over the globe who've seen in this book a God who is a friend, is it probative? And if you say none of that matters because the colonizers enslaved people, then you're saying that they get to decide Christian theology. And I just fundamentally disagree. And so when I look across the history, especially of the black church in America, you see person after person after person, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, all of these characters, people who saw in this book a God who liberates. That's the Bible that I was taught. I was taught that version of Christianity. And that version of Christianity works for me. And so I find it compelling, and I can't, I just don't, I understand how people see it the other way, so I can't say I can't understand it. I feel that way too. The passages that trouble me too. But I think that the collective weight and testimony of Christian theology is that there's a way of reading it in ways that is liberative. Yeah. And that's not by distorting the text, it's by reading with the text, canonically, and understood rightly.
And I guess I think the subtitle of the book is An Exercise in Hope.
African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope.
Well, there you go, the long version of it all.
Just helping you out.
Exactly, very good, thank you.
Yeah.
I was quite intrigued by that word hope and the focus of it, and the stress in the book about the hope as a kind of discipline. Yeah. And I guess I wanted you to ask you about how does that sort of discipline of hope stop becoming just a kind of slightly naive optimism, refusal to face the injustices of life? How do you what is that hope?
So
how does it stop becoming something a little bit
exercise for me, I don't know if it's for you, it's something some days I really want to go off on a run. Some days I just want to sleep. And
most days I want to sleep.
Yeah, a lot of days I want to sleep. But it's a discipline because I know that it's good for me. And sometimes in the days where I didn't want to exercise, I get out there and I was like, I'm so glad that I did this. And I'm black in America. I see stuff all of the time that makes me just want to lay in the bed and to give up. But hope is a practice. I choose, hopefully inspired by the Spirit, to not give up hope. It is not naive optimism because, and I always think about theology, and theology has a certain order to it. And what I mean to it is that a lot of times our theological despair happens when we reorient questions. And so for me, the first question I always ask myself, was the tomb empty on that first Easter morning? And if that tomb was empty, if it actually was true, Christ was risen from the dead, traveling down death by death, nothing can actually put Jesus back in the tomb. So white supremacy, which comes after Jesus, can't unresurrect him. And so when I see the world only through the brokenness of it and the things that people do to black and brown people in my country and other countries, if that becomes my sole focus, then sometimes I struggle with hope. But when I ask myself, do I believe like the testimony of the women? Do I believe the tomb was empty? And those experiences that I had with God, were they real? One of the things that I talk about is that suffering can make us sometimes relitigate our past. So something happens really, really difficult in our lives, and we kind of go, you know what? All those experiences I had with God, it must have been pizza that I ate that day. And all of the things that have brought you into the church, you explain away, you kind of retell your story. And I want to say, no, when I struggle with hope, I say, no. Those experiences I had were genuine. I did experience the presence of God in the midst of suffering in the past. And not only was that my experience is genuine, the convictions I had about what God was up to in the world were genuine. And then when I'm having a real bad day, I just start running back through my family's history. That my mother's faith was genuine. My grandmother's faith was genuine. That my ancestors passed down a way of following God in the world that has carried our family through unimaginable trauma. And so for me, those are kind of the processes that I go through. And sometimes it's like a practice. And the other option is nihilism. And nihilism has never saved anybody.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to move on. Let me just go back 10 minutes or so for this conversation before we open it out to others as well. So please keep coming sending your questions in. I'd like to move on a little bit to the kind of the United States and where it's at the moment.
We're doing great.
Exactly.
Have you heard something different?
You have a little election coming up later on in the year, and one of your electoral candidates has just become a felon. And,
only 34.
Exactly. But
who amongst us has not committed 34 crimes? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I'd love to know your reading of the Trump phenomenon, because I guess one reading of it is that it's just ignorance and xenophobia and and that kind of partiality. Another reading of it is that it's a protest from those who've been left behind in the liberal story of progress.
Yeah.
And who feel kind of shut out from the gravy train of success in American life.
Yeah.
How do you read that?
Well, it's easy. It's so many ways to enter this story, and we've been talking about it for like a decade, I feel like. But I guess I'll say this, is that America has a lot of cultural and political problems that not simply Donald Trump. That sometimes, like I said, the pressures reveal like who the church is and what it's about. And so for, at least in the civil rights movement, African Americans in particular have said the church in America has a problem with race. It's not really dealt with the issues of racism and xenophobia and fear of the foreigner. That America doesn't actually have the American church doesn't have a political theology. It actually learns how to care for the oppressed. And that any discussion of justice and social action is dismissed as liberalism, that this is the problem. And we were told over and over again that this is not what we need to do, that we need to focus on evangelizing as many people as possible. And if you evangelize as many people as possible, then that'll just deal with racism magically. And so then you have a candidate who comes along and who says things that are fundamentally, we also said the church has issues with sexism. Like we just said this stuff and we would just dismiss this. It's crazy. So then you have a candidate who engages in activities that are deeply offensive to people of color and women, but because the American church does not value racism as a deal breaker, then those things are washed aside. And so it's not that Donald Trump created these problems, he revealed them. So, in other words, if we said, hey, there's a race problem in the church, and there's people in your church with unaddressed racial biases, and we were told to be quiet, then when the issues of race emerge, and there's a candidate who says, forget all of this stuff, I can make you richer, right? I can keep you safe from the dangerous foreigners who are out there, playing on America's worst fears, then what you actually are seeing is the idea that fundamentally racism and injustice are not deal breakers for significant portions of the Christian voting bloc in America. And that may seem harsh, but that's the only way I can describe it. And so one of the things that happens is that, especially people of color, we're always low on the priority scale. So once we deal with this issue and that issue and that issue, then we'll get around to race. And so because we're never the priority, then someone's offensive behaviors against us isn't probative. And so I think that you're seeing that. And I do think that you also are seeing an aggressive secularism that only depicts Christians in the worst possible light. And one of the things that, and I don't agree with this, but if you're going to say we're the worst, and Christianity is a net negative in society, and they feel isolated, and they kind of go, well, I'll become the very thing that you describe us as. Now, that's not the most mature way of responding to it, but I do think that there is a real sense in which there's a perception that the culture is actively anti-Christian. Now, one of the things about that, and I'm sorry, yes, about American politics, one of the things about that is that at the heart of that, American culture is anti-Christian. It's the assumption that it was Christian in the past, and that it's looking towards this golden era where everybody was loving Jesus and going to church and, wearing dresses, like the traditional garb, and the men worked and all of that stuff, right? But that was during segregation, right? And so for a black person, I don't look back to the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, some golden era that I'm trying to return to. And so the entire mythology that's leading to this Make America Great Again presumes a version of American greatness, which means, once again, the claim that African Americans were making in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that the country is fundamentally broken has not been addressed. And so until we face the issue of our legacy, racism, Jim Crow, slavery, and we pretend there is this mythic America that existed. Any appeal to that's going to kind of galvanize a portion of the population. And so we're seeing, in the context of demographic changes, another one of those galvanizing forces. And I think it's happening in the UK. Sorry, this is like talking about y'all. I've seen some of the people who were like leading the new atheists and now call themselves cultural Christians, right? Precisely in the face of demographic changes. And so you're saying, oh no, society is becoming more diverse. Well, bring the Christians back, right? Put them in charge. It'll be much safer. And so I think that unless the culture understands the people who are coming to us and the people who live amongst us, who've been here, like my family, for generations in America, are not dangers, but are Christian brothers and sisters who deserve equal dignity and respect, or our non-believing brothers and sisters who deserve equal dignity and respect and our service. They're not the enemy, they're the objects of God's affection. And I think that we have a culture in America that's fundamentally afraid, even though the gospel begins with the message of the angels, right? Do not be afraid. And so that's one of the things.
Yeah. Thank you, Esau. And just one last question before we open out to some wider question. I guess in recent times, you've been teaching New Testament at Wheaton and various places for quite some time. You're a scholar of the New Testament, have written books about that. More recently, you've moved into the space of kind of writing for Washington Post, for New York Times. And I guess that's something that's great interest to us in the Center for Cultural Witness, which is about strengthening the voice of the church and Christian faith in public life. And I'd love to know why you made that move and how you go about it and how you do write for a kind of secular audience like that.
I can tell you one of many moments, but I was sitting in a room like this, finishing my PhD program, and they were telling you how to get jobs. Here we had these meetings, how do you get a job? And the guy was standing up there and he was like, well, if you want to get a job in biblical studies, you have to be very quiet. Like, don't say anything on the internet because people will see it and then they won't hire you. And I remember thinking, this is 2017, 2018, 2016, before Trump, 15, 16. And I remember thinking, well, black people are dying in America. And if I have to be quiet not to get a job, I just won't get a job. I'm not saying that's what you should do. I'm telling you, it happened to work for me. So I started, I was working on my PhD during the day, and at home, I would just go and just like write blogs on the internet. This is like when blogging was a thing. And from there, I started writing for the Living Church, which is an Anglican, Episcopal Anglican magazine in the States. And from there, it went from Christianity Today, and from there, the Washington Post, from there, the New York Times. And what was really important to me was I wanted to write something that would actually make a difference to the community that I lived in. As much as I love my PhD, I knew what nobody from my neighborhood going to read that book. And as a matter of fact, you didn't invite me. You have a bunch of piles. You don't got my dissertation here. And so I just realized the stuff that I was working on was too far from the people that I loved and I cared about. And so I had to write something that would mean something to them. And what I've discovered as a writer is that, especially when you write for a secular space, you can't tell them what to do. In other words, I don't say, here is what you must do to the New York Times. Like, what do they care what some Bible guy says? But what I can do to them is say, here's how Christianity shapes my imagination and changes the way that I see the world. And I can speak from that perspective and say, here's how the gospel upsets these simple ways of looking at the world. And one of the other things that I've seen is people, I think, respond to vulnerability. We were raised back in the day when they had reruns on television. Remember this? I don't know if you had this in the state here, but like MacGyver or like these things. You know, MacGyver was always trapped. Sorry, this is like a guy who found himself always in trouble. The bomb's about to go off in a few minutes. It's like, how is MacGyver going to get out of this? But MacGyver only works if you actually think he's in danger. In other words, the scenario seems impossible, but somehow he escaped. Oh, he did it again, right? Almost like Sherlock Holmes. And so I realized that a lot of times Christian writers, we kind of cook the books in favor of God. So the first thing that we do, we tone down the problem so there's less work for God to do to fix it. And I said, no, because people know that, right? But if I talk about the problems the church is facing, using the language that non-believers do, then we're talking about the same thing. So I can't talk about racism in ways that feels like I'm afraid to acknowledge how broken the church is. When I say it that way, people tend to lean forward. And then they're willing to hear my solution. If they feel like I'm not being honest about the state of the world, they're going to say this is Pollyannish. But if I say, no, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, this is what is at stake, then they might be willing to hear how God might have something to say. I remember, and so like MacGyver, you have to actually write yourself into the actual problem that is the actual question the culture is asking and see if there's a solution. I remember when I was writing, because I try not to be all Jesus all of the time because they would get tired of me there. But I remember after George Floyd died, and there was a video. You know the video? Yeah. And I remember at the time seeing growing up the pictures of black bodies that had been lynched, and the people posed in front of the pictures. And they would take home pieces of the fingers and the toes home from the lynchings. This is actually true in America. And they would like keep them. And so you can Google lynchings in America and see actual people, just like families. And I saw George Floyd's video, and my mind went straight back to those images of lynchings. You could also see in the videos of the water hoses and the dogs they placed on black people in the civil rights movement. And so I'm starting to write my response to George Floyd. And it says, oh, there's a picture. There's a video. And I just list all of these things. And I got to the end of that litany of things, and I had no solution. Because normally I try to find some kind of broad, we should love each other, like something that's like easily accessible to the wider society. But for that particular article, you can find this called What the Bible Says About Black Anger. I said, these jokers need Jesus. And so I just gave full, it's like the cross breaks the wheel. In that particular article, in that particular place, I said the solution to our problems is to understand that in the cross of Jesus, there's both, all of the things that are there. But it was only because, and they put that in the newspaper, I can't believe they did it. It was only because I was honest about what I was feeling that I won the right to talk about how I dealt with it. And I think that if you want to be a Christian writer, the one thing, a writer, whatever you want to call it, you can't be afraid. You have to write the book or the article that terrifies you. My next book is on the Bible and slavery. How to read the book that sets you free. That's the title. Because I'm afraid, right? And so if you don't face those fears, then we're cowering, off stage. And we have to sometimes, put the pen to paper and trust the Spirit of God to, lead you home.
Esau, thank you so much for fascinating things to think about and talk about.